breakdown on these three gods earlier, and I've got some literature about both of them. Each one of them has gotten their own, myth story. Each one has gotten like a profile breakdown. So I wanted to bring all three of them together because it makes an interesting um, conversation in terms of like what they represented, why people flocked to them, like why some people went with Yahweh, or excuse me, Agwe, and why some cultures were more aligned with the Norse. So I want to talk about what they actually represented. So I'm going to have to start over again with this one because this is some big important stuff in terms of what each of them actually represented. So I'm going to start from the beginning and what they each represented, and then we'll get into the timeline of why their beliefs matter, right? So let's start at the top. Let's start with Njörðr, right? Who is the sea as movement. This is the Norse contribution, and he is at the core about the wind and sails. This wasn't a war god, but he does make war possible. What he actually governs is favorable winds, wealth through trade, and sea prosperity. Now, what he really carries though is not just traders and explorers, but he also is the god of raiders, right? The favorable winds that he talks about were often winds that were used for raiding. So this is a lot about who he was. Now he represents some scarcity for these people. The land didn't, give an overabundance of food and things like that. So they had to go out, right? They had to go out. Now, in some instances, they did do trade, but most notably for those outside of their region, we're kind of more knowledge about them in the sense that they were raiders, right? Those are the primary stories that people who were outside their tradition got back. Then, of course, there's Poseidon. And Poseidon on the far end, he was actually depth. He was not an intimate version of the sea god in the way that these two would be. He's the earth shaker. He's a storm bringer. He's a ruler. So he doesn't relate to fishermen, right? He punishes. We know about his rivalry or his issue with Odysseus and the travels. And this was a deity who was associated with the Mediterranean at this time. So this is maritime and imperial power. This is about trade, naval warfare, and this was about colonization routes and his divine temper. So he sees people as subjects. So Agwe is more about the coastal rootedness. He's about community preservation, ritual exchange. So he's going to be very different. He is the one who comes about after a lot of the colonial routes had already been established, right? This is kind of where he comes from. So there is some differences in where they go about, whereas Njörðr was mobility, expansion, opportunity. Poseidon was authority, control, consequence. Your Agwe was more about the people. He became the protector of the people who have been trafficked around. So Yahweh functionally says, "You are my people." Njörðr says, "You are travelers." Poseidon says, "You are beneath my tides." Agwe was about sustenance. Njörðr about movement, and Poseidon would be about power. I'm going to talk about these in greater details because the timeline ultimately matters. So we might as well get into the timeline and we can see how these various gods develop. And I think Yahweh is probably the last one that we really see. But let's take a venture into it and see how this comes about. Okay.
Read 2000 BCE. Location: West African coastal regions, faun and eucultural zones. Event: Proto, West African sea spirit veneration emerges. Significance: maritime spirits associated with navigation, wealth, and the unknown sea form the conceptual foundation that later informs Agwe.
So this is where Yahweh starts. So again, his foundation is the earliest. Actually, you see, he's about 2,000 years.
2000 BCE. Location: Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Event: Proto-Germanic sea and fertility deity archetype emerges. Significance: early maritime and prosperity deities form the conceptual foundation that later informs Njörðr.
So this is important. So Njord is coming out pretty quickly after this whole time period, right? I'm trying to get my sound off here. Sorry. So we can kind of see pretty quickly who he becomes. So these guys are kind of forming around the same periods of time, at least Agwe in Africa and Njörðr in Scandinavia.
1600 BCE. Location, Mycenaean Greece. Event, Proto-Poseidon referenced in Linear B tablets, spelled Poseidon significance.
So this is 400 years later, after the first, like the beginning of Agwe. Now we're seeing the beginning of Poseidon.
This early written reference predates many Olympian developments and suggests Poseidon may have been a major deity in Mycenaean religion. 1200 BCE. Location, Aegean region. Event, Earthshaker and sea deity attributes consolidate.
So this is like the core of Poseidon coming in. So from 800 years after they first talking about Agwe, now we see Poseidon as the earth shaker, the sea deity that he would be most known for as a consolidate.
Poseidon becomes firmly associated with earthquakes and the sea as maritime identity strengthens in coastal Greek culture. 800 BCE. Location, Greece. Event, Homeric epics composed, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Man, this is the first time I think we get a real insight into Poseidon, right? This is who Poseidon is. Poseidon is a dude that has beef, right? Poseidon is a dude that has beef, and no one personifies this beef more than Odysseus. And this goes back to obviously Odysseus and his time on the island, one of the islands he stops at. He blinds a one-eyed man, right? The one-eyed giant, the Cyclops, right? I keep forgetting this. So after he blinds the Cyclops, now you got beef with Poseidon. Imagine that, right? Now you have beef with the god, and we would see that follow him throughout the 10 or 20 years it takes for him to get back home, as he's constantly fighting against this god at every single turn. So Poseidon proved himself to be, and that's something that the Greek gods did. They would be more personal. They had no problem getting down and dirty with you.
Significance. Poseidon is portrayed as a powerful Olympian who opposes Odysseus and influences events of the Trojan War.
Yeah, he wasn't just messing with Odysseus. He was influencing the Trojan War, right? 100%. He was on the side of the Greeks who were coming in to take over the city. And so he was doing everything he could. So the gods in this time had a more direct influence. And this is where Poseidon was. He directly was influenced into the war.
700 BCE. Location, Greece. Event, Hesiod's Theogony written. Significance, Poseidon is formally identified as son of Cronus and Rhea.
Wow, I didn't realize that it took that long before the literature really caught up. But yeah, he is one of the more important deities because he starts off in that Titanomachy. And I thought that was written previously, but I guess we're just seeing that at about 700 BCE.
The division of the cosmos among Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon is recorded. 650 BCE. Location, Athens, Greece.
So, man, Poseidon is really picking up steam right here, where the other gods have not gotten as involved culturally. We haven't seen shifts as great as theirs.
Event, Contest of Athens myth circulates. Significance, Poseidon competes with it.
Now, this is one that we really remember as, or at least I remember as one of the more important kind of myth stories, because Poseidon takes an L to Athena, and the city of Greece decides who they would align themselves with. Now, with Poseidon, because you didn't choose him, I feel like it was always going to be a problem. Now, I always thought these two events were flipped. I always thought that this came before the story of Odysseus, which would explain that a lot, like how the seas became basically hostile, right, to the Greek people. But this is reversed. So I learned something in this MythLab already.
Athena for patronage of Athens, reinforcing his identity as rival and seabringer. 500 BCE. Location, Scandinavia. Event, Vani fertility cult traditions active. Significance, the Vani are associated with fertility, wealth, and...
Oh, so this is the Vanir. So this is one of the things I've been struggling to understand about Norse mythology is the Vanir contribution, right? So we have the Aesir. Those are the ones that we actually know the most. That's when we're talking about Thor, Odin, not even locally, but Balder. These are all Aesirs. And the Vanir were a sister group that they eventually went to war with. And this war came to a point, like it ended by them all getting together and saying, hey, let's stop killing each other, right? So they had a whole like kumbaya moment, and they traded people to keep the peace. They traded people. So Njörðr was a Vanir who goes to live with the Aesir, with the Asgardians as we know them.
Njörðr later emerges as a chief Barney god. 500 BCE. Location: Cape Saunion, Greece. Event: Temple of Poseidon active. Significance: Major sanctuary overlooking the sea. Sailors offer prayers before voyages. 400.
That's important that there's an actual temple. And I don't think any of the other deities here had temples in the same way that Poseidon did. So we'll see as this kind of plays out.
BCE. Location: Greece. Event: Classical Greek sculpture of Poseidon widespread. Significance: Trident imagery becomes standardized, reinforcing sea sovereignty symbolism. 100 CE. Location: Scandinavia. Event: Expansion of seafaring culture in Nordic regions.
Uh-oh. Right? And this would be a problem if you're other cultures because now they've got more access to the sea. Now, part of what they did was some trade, but unfortunately, what we know a lot about them, a lot more, is a lot of raiding. So that has to factor into the conversation. So when they gain further access as a seafaring culture, what it meant to the people who were ultimately surrounding them.
Significance: Maritime trade and fishing culture strengthen theological emphasis on sea gods such as Njörðr. 200 CE. Location: Roman Empire. Event: Poseidon identified with Neptune. Significance: Greek Poseidon merges with Roman.
This was a huge, huge thing, right? Because culturally, the Greeks have been running the world, or at least what we would call the West, for all this time. Now the Romans come in much larger, and they don't completely wipe out the Greek. They align them with their own deities. And this is where we see this Poseidon Neptune merger. Although I felt like they were fundamentally different because they represented the sea. And that's a conversation that we'll have, the differences between the two. Because they're merged in the sea, but I think there's some differences between the two.
Neptune, expanding influence across the Mediterranean. 400 CE. Location: Roman Empire. Event: Decline of Olympian worship under Christian rule. Significance: Formal worship of Poseidon fades but survives in myth and literature.
Now, Poseidon's had a huge drop off. Like, he didn't survive in the way that Zeus had survived. He's still around. He still gets to be in movies, a lot of times in the same movies as Zeus. We'll see he and Zeus kind of together. I mean, we saw him in the Wrath of the Titans, but Poseidon was fading away while Hades and Zeus, the two brothers, fought together. But Poseidon or Neptune didn't figure in that as strongly, although we know a lot more about his sons and his influence.
800 CE. Location: Scandinavia. Event: Njörðr established as major Vani deity. Significance: Njörðr recognized as god of the sea, wind, wealth, and seafaring prosperity.
I mean, he was an important deity because this was a guy you came to make offerings to try to make sure that you had a successful sea voyage.
900 CE. Location: Scandinavia. Event: Myths of Njörðr and Skadi circulate orally.
So this is kind of where we go. We're seeing a full timeline going from the early 2000s to now. And culturally, what would happen is Agwe would survive through the belief systems of the people. He comes after. Let me see if I can pull up this timeline here. He comes after all the colonialism has gone down. That's when he starts to be a part of cultural expression in a major way. And we would see with him, he becomes now about 1900 1950. He starts to be really a part of voodoo belief system. So over the 1500s, 1980, we would see him venerated as he becomes part of the Haitian diaspora communities. And that would be, he moves to the point where he's now seen as a Loa. He's invoked in healing and protection narratives. And all three of these guys, now Poseidon and Agwe, I have seen become part of the digital world. So they're very much remembered when we talk about like actively, like in modern movies, in modern games, things like that. So we're seeing Agwe and Poseidon, not so much as Njörðr, although I'm sure he's still remembered within culturally within his community. Now, what I thought was interesting is that Njörðr seemed like the deity that if you were going to be a raider, he would be the one that you would pray to. Whereas Yahweh is the deity that you would pray to after all that, colonization, and Poseidon was in on that as well. After all this colonization, Yahweh seems like he would be the deity that you would pray to afterwards because he's there about protecting the people and holding them culturally together. But we see, like looking at culturally, we see three representations of what a sea god would look like, and obviously very different in what their portrayals. Physically, they're very differently. How the people actually were to respond to them is extremely different. And the timelines of how they develop, while they run kind of parallel in some points, early on we see the establishment of Njörðr and Poseidon, but more in modern times, at least starting about 1900s, especially around the Caribbean, we see him start, Yahweh at least, start to be overlapped with Christian beliefs and more involved with just general voodoo practices. So just kind of a brief, jump in on sea sovereignty and a timeline. And I'll probably go a little bit deeper, but each one of these characters, I did build a timeline on my Myth Archives channel. But if you want some more like discussion or mythology, go back to Nine World Chronicles. I'll pop the link in here, and you guys can get a little bit of study time about who these deities were and learn a little bit more about them. But as always, thanks for stopping in. I wanted to do a good 30 minutes. My material fell a little bit short, but I will be back on tomorrow and we'll have another discussion. In that one, I may go deeper into sea gods. Because I've got some others I want to talk about. But send me your thoughts, and I'll decide tonight what the topic